3. And if you have your class books with you, go ahead and open to page 37. Page 37. We're going to fill out that last section there on page 37. There are some things on page 38 that I'm not going to mention. Well, actually, 38 and 39. There's some extra material there. I'm not going to mention what's on pages 38 and 39. They're just there for your reference. I had planned on just discussing briefly at the top of page 38 those Christological claims that Matthew is making in this section of his narrative. But for the sake of time today, I'm not going to mention those, and there's no blanks there to fill out. I'll just refer you to those just to give you some food for thought. What we're going to discuss today is on page 37, that last section that's called Allusions to Old Testament Texts. Last week, as we have been examining the portion of Matthew's narrative that we call Matthew 3:1 to 4:1, that's just the chunk of text that we're focusing on the last few weeks. Last week we began examining Matthew's use of the Old Testament in this section. And I've said it before several times, I'll say it again. If you want to have a deeper understanding of Matthew's gospel, then you must engage with his use of the Old Testament through his quotations and through his allusions that we're going to look at today, where he alludes to Old Testament texts, because he's doing that to give us the lenses through which to see who Jesus is and the significance of the events that are surrounding his life. And so to just read Matthew's quotations of the Old Testament or to ignore the allusions he's making means that our knowledge of Matthew's gospel will always be impoverished. And so in this class, we're taking the time to go back and examine, how is Matthew using the Old Testament? What does he want us to take from these texts that he both quotes and or alludes to? Now, last week, we examined the quotation that you can see at the beginning of Matthew 3, where Matthew quotes from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. And he quotes from Isaiah 40, verse 3, in order to give us the proper understanding of who John the Baptizer is. And we examined that last week, that John the Baptizer is the voice in the wilderness that Isaiah 40 had promised, the voice that would announce that God is coming back to his people to reign as king. And John is that voice. And so John is the voice announcing the arrival of God to reign as king. Well, then what does that say about Jesus? Because John is announcing also, well, Jesus, this is the one to whom I'm pointing. And so we talked about the implications of that the coming of God as king is the same as the coming of Jesus as king, because Jesus is, as Matthew has already told us, in Matthew 1:23, Jesus is God with us. And so Jesus will be the agent, the embodiment of God's kingship, coming to earth to restore all things and to right all wrongs. And so that is who John the Baptizer is. He's the voice who is announcing all of that and preaching about the reign of heaven, the promised reign of God that Isaiah talked about. Now, what we're going to discuss today, though, are two allusions that Matthew gives to us. Both of them come from the voice from heaven. When Jesus is baptized, a voice from heaven speaks. And the voice from heaven gives us two different Old Testament lenses through which to see Jesus, so that we can understand who he is and why he is significant. Those two lenses are the Son of God as the Davidic king. That's one lens the voice from heaven gives us. The second lens is the servant of Isaiah. Or maybe a better way to say it is, the servant of God described in Isaiah. We're going to look at both of those lenses today, and we're going to start with the Son of God. Before we do that, I need to show you this verse. I need to show you a very important background text for understanding what we're going to examine today and understanding the allusion that the voice from heaven makes. When Jesus is baptized and he comes up out of the water, Matthew 3 tells us that a voice from heaven then speaks, and the voice from heaven says, "This is my Son." Now there's more the voice from heaven says, but for right now we're just focusing on that segment of it. When the voice from heaven says, "This is my Son," there is an allusion there to a very important theme of the Old Testament. The theme is explicitly stated in 2 Samuel 7. I'm going to put that verse on the screen because we need to understand this foundation before we look at the passage that the voice is specifically alluding to. But in 2 Samuel 7, God makes a promise to King David. And I want you to notice the words on the screen. I want you to notice what this promise to David entails. Here it is. God says to David, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." Now, in the immediate context of 2 Samuel 7, in the immediate context, who is God talking about here? Who's the son of David who builds a house for God, a temple? Solomon. Solomon. In the immediate context, this passage is talking about Solomon. And God establishes the kingdom of Solomon. Solomon is a successful king. However, what happened to Solomon's kingdom? It was destroyed. Not just after his death. After his death, it's rent apart, where he loses, the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, loses the 10 northern tribes of Israel. But then when Babylon comes and destroys Jerusalem, Babylon removes the Davidic line of kings. And since the Babylonian exile, there has not been a son of David to sit on the throne, let alone a son of David whose kingdom was established. And yet God says in this passage, "I'm going to establish your kingdom forever." And so we could say that this passage has dual meanings. On the one hand, it's talking about Solomon. But as history unfolded, and as we go back and we look at this passage and we know the history, we can't help but come to the conclusion, just like the Jewish readers did who were reading this passage, that this passage seems to be talking about somebody more than Solomon. Because God promised to establish David's throne forever. So either God has revoked that promise. Maybe he said, "Forget about it, I take that back." Or maybe God is not powerful enough to keep this promise. Or what Matthew is going to tell us, what he's already told us in his gospel is, Jesus is this son of David. He is the son of David who will have the kingdom established forever. And notice in this passage what God says about the Davidic line of kings. David, your son, is going to rule forever, and he will be a son to me, and I'll be a father to him. That relationship of God as the Father, and then the Son of David, the King, being the Son of God, that is reflected on and expounded on in Psalm 2. Would you flip there? I had you go to Matthew 3, because that's what we're studying, but I forgot. We're going to start looking at Psalm 2 here. This is the psalm that the voice from heaven alludes to when the voice from heaven says, "This is my son." There's an allusion to Psalm 2. Go to this psalm, and we're going to examine this. Because Matthew has included this for us, because Matthew wants us to see Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2. Well, what do we gain from that? Well, let's look at it. Let's look at what Psalm 2 is all about. Now, the specific verse is Psalm 2, verse 7. That's what the voice from heaven alludes to. But this is a very short psalm. We're going to look at the whole thing so we can understand what verse 7 is saying in its context. This entire psalm is a reflection on what you just saw in 2 Samuel 7. God's promise that the Davidic line of kings, it's the son of David who's going to rule, and this son of David will be a son to me. Psalm 2 is an expansion of that thought, a reflection of that thought about God's promise to rule through the Davidic kingship. So let's look at it. Look what Psalm 2 says. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his anointed, or Messiah, or Christ, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords away from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. Yahweh said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel.' Now, therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve Yahweh with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Now, let's note three big points that this psalm makes as it reflects on the promise of God to David that his son will rule forever. And by extension, the whole Davidic line of kings, but specifically, this one son of David who will fulfill everything that this psalm talks about. Let's just put on the screen here three big points that this psalm makes. First, we need to recognize this. God will rule creation through the Davidic dynasty. God will rule creation through the Davidic dynasty. This is a key idea that we need to make sure we understand from the biblical story, the biblical worldview. God is king, yes, but he has chosen to exercise his kingship through the Davidic line of kings. And therefore, by extension, Israel. Because remember, David is the son of Abraham. He's an Israelite. And so, as we've talked about before in this class, God will exercise his kingship through Israel. Israel is his instrument. But God then narrows that down within Israel to the specific line of David. It is through the Davidic kings that God will exercise his rule over the earth. That's one element of this psalm that we need to recognize. The second element is the element that the voice from heaven alludes to from verse 7 of Psalm 2. The Davidic king is pronounced as God's son. That's the relationship that God will have with this king. The Davidic king is pronounced as God's son. And then the third big idea from this psalm. If God is going to rule creation through the Davidic kingship, well, then that means this last point, rebellion against the Davidic king, is the same as rebellion against God. Rebellion against the Davidic king is rebellion against God. I want you to see this in the psalm itself. Look at verses 2 and 3 of Psalm 2. Notice how the psalm makes this point. Rebelling against God is the same as rebelling against His anointed, His Christ, His Messiah. Look at the question that's asked in verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against His anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. In other words, the psalmist is making the point, why do the nations try to rebel against God and His anointed king? It's futile. They plot in vain. In fact, look at what he says in verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. I mean, just imagine the picture here that God has said, I'm going to rule through the Davidic kingship. And then the nations say, oh, let's cast away those cords. Let's try to break free from the reign of God. And the picture in verse 4 is God sits in the heavens and just goes, you're so foolish. As if you have any chance of succeeding in rebelling against me. He laughs at this. But notice that rebellion against God is the same as rebellion against His anointed. In fact, also, look at the end of the psalm. Look in verses 11 and 12. Serve Yahweh with fear and rejoice with trembling. But then here's the parallel. Kiss the Son, lest He be angry and you perish in the way. Serving God and serving the Son are synonymous. Because God is ruling through His Son, the Davidic king. So to rebel against the Davidic king is the same as rebelling against God Himself. And I want you to notice the extent of the Davidic king's rule. Look in verse 7 of Psalm 2. I will tell of the decree. Yahweh said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. So how great is the Davidic king's rule? According to this psalm, it's the whole world. The entire world will come under the rule of this Davidic king. So again, you can see how Solomon fulfills some of this, but this also seems to be describing somebody much greater than Solomon. Because Solomon didn't rule over the whole world. But this psalm makes it clear that's exactly the extent of the son of David that God's talking about here through the psalmist. It's all nations. It's the world. And what's going to happen to those nations who rebel against the anointed? Well, look at verse 9. You, that is the Davidic king, you shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. That will be the fate of all the nations who decide to rebel against God's chosen king. Now let's pivot here. If the voice from heaven is making an allusion to Psalm 2, verse 7, and the voice from heaven in Matthew, by recording it for us, if he wants us to see Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2, that Jesus is the Son of God, the Davidic king, which Matthew has already emphasized repeatedly in his gospel, well then what do we take from this? What does it mean that Jesus is the Son of God, the Davidic king? Well, here's what it means to see Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2. It means that Jesus is the Davidic king through whom God will rule all creation. Jesus is the Davidic king through whom God will rule all creation. Because that's what Psalm 2 promised. Psalm 2 promised that this son of David will rule to the ends of the earth. All nations are his heritage. All the earth is his possession. So if the voice from heaven is saying, hey, this Jesus that just came up out of the water, this is my son, then that means then this Nazarene is the king over all the earth. He is the one God has chosen through whom to rule. And it also means that rebellion against Jesus is rebellion against God himself. That's what Psalm 2 made clear. In fact, Psalm 2, just think about it now through looking at that or using that as a lens through which to understand Jesus. We can echo the psalmist's thoughts at the beginning. Why do the nations plot in vain to rebel against Yahweh and his anointed, Jesus of Nazareth? It's vain. God just laughs at that. All the people who think we don't have to kneel to this Jesus, we don't have to be loyal to his kingship, God just laughs. You're just fools. This is my king. This is my son. Jesus is the Davidic king who will rule all creation. And interestingly in Matthew, you remember in Psalm 2, the psalmist talks about the nations. And actually Rex mentioned it in his sermon today. The Gentiles, all those who aren't Jews. Why do the nations rage? But notice in Matthew's gospel, this very interesting shift. In Matthew's gospel, who are the ones who rage and plot against the anointed king? In Matthew's gospel, who is it who plots against the king? The Jewish leaders. And so in Matthew's gospel, the Jewish leaders who are physically members of Israel, physically members of the people through whom God would rule, by their rebellion against Jesus, they shift themselves into the category of the nations who are outside the bounds of God's blessing. So just an interesting shift in Matthew's gospel. And in contrast to that, those in Matthew's gospel and us who are Gentiles who kiss the Son, who kneel in submission to the Son, we then become members of the people of the King, even though ethnically we're Gentiles. What questions or thoughts do you have? Before I'm going to make a couple applications. What questions or thoughts do you have on seeing Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2 and the voice from heaven giving us that lens by saying, this is my son, and making that allusion to Psalm 2 verse 7? What questions or thoughts do you have on this? Well, let me make a couple applications before we leave this lens through which to see Jesus. These applications are not in your book. I added these after. So feel free you can just write these down on the side of page 37 or maybe at the bottom. Although, be advised, I am going to give a couple applications at the for the next allusion, for Isaiah 42. So maybe on the right of the page, might be a little better here. But let me just give you these two applications because I want us to now kind of wrestle with, okay, Nathan, that's interesting. And that helps me to understand what the voice from heaven is saying. It helps me to understand Jesus in relation to Psalm 2. But what's a takeaway for this? Why is this important for us? Let me give you two. The first is general, the second is then going to be more specific to us. Here's the first application. We need to understand that every human being lives under the kingship of Jesus. Every human being lives under the kingship of Jesus. That is one thing we need to take away from seeing Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2. No human is exempt from his rule. The ends of the earth are his possession. I think this needs to be emphasized. This point, it needs to be emphasized for two reasons, in my opinion. One reason is because, I've mentioned this before in this class, our nation's history, the United States, our whole history is based on denigrating the idea of kingship. Our country was founded on the premise that kingship is bad, democracy is great. Now, a democratic government does have blessings that we enjoy, and we need to thank God for those blessings. But what I think maybe can happen, even without us realizing it, is that we can forget that the real reality in which we live, the eternal reality under which we live, is that we live under a kingship. We live in a kingdom that was created by the King, Yahweh of hosts, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so, if we understand that we live under a king, that should have some ramifications for how we live, for the choices that we make. And I would submit this to you. Because of our love of democracy, it can cause us to forget that the ultimate good for creation and the ultimate good for us as human beings is not a democratic government where humans and angels can now vote on things. We can vote away sin. The ultimate good for creation and human beings is God's kingship, is to be ruled over by God. A perfectly good, perfectly wise, perfectly sacrificial king. That is the ultimate good for us. And our country's history of denigrating kingship can cause us to miss this fact. Yes, ma'am, Miss Gloria. Yeah. Yes, Miss Gloria just brought up in our country's history, so many that came over from the European countries were trying to get away from the abuses of kingship. And certainly, human kings, more often than not, have abused that office. But the problem then is not kingship per se. The problem is we don't have the right king. We need Jesus as king. And that's who they wanted to kneel to, yes. Yeah, very good. A second reason that I think this application is worth emphasizing is that also part of our history in this country is a separation of church and state. And what that phrase has become, how it's evolved over time, is that, well, there are some things over here that we're willing to say that you religious people, you can kind of put that under the umbrella of religion. That's fine if you want to have that. But over here, the church, quote unquote, religion has nothing to do with this over here. This is, quote unquote, secular over here. So if you guys over there, if you want to bow before some king, Jesus, you go ahead, but that's not me. I don't believe in that. And so what can happen is, and maybe sometimes we can start to have shades of this. We probably don't adopt it that explicitly, but we maybe can start getting flavors of it in our mind, is that we start to kind of think to ourselves that, well, yeah, there are certain parts of life or certain aspects of Jesus' kingship that he rules over, but then over here, this is kind of free from that. This is neutral territory. when it comes to the kingship of Jesus. And what we need to understand by seeing Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2 is that those notions that our country has come up with are completely false. Everything in creation is ruled over by Jesus the King. There is nothing outside the bounds of his kingship. There is no human being who is a neutral party who can say, I'm not going to kneel to Jesus, I'm going to bow out. That's fine for you. Every human being is under the kingship of Jesus. And that then leads to the second application, where this will kind of bring it home to us as human beings. If this is true, which I've argued vehemently that it is, well, then we need to understand this point. Every human being is therefore judged as a loyal subject of their king or a rebel to their king. Every human being is under the kingship of Jesus. Therefore, every human being will be judged as either a loyal subject or a rebel. There is no third category. And if you want to know, what does it look like for a human being to live in submission to the King, Jesus? What does it mean for a human being to kiss the Son, as Psalm 2 talked about? Matthew tells us. Just flip 2 pages over in your Bible and read the Sermon on the Mount. And then you will see, here's what a life looks like of someone who is loyal to the King, to the reign of heaven. Here it is. This is what it means to be a loyal subject of King Jesus. What questions or thoughts do you have on these applications about seeing Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2? Yes, sir, Mr. Mill. Yes. Yeah, I love the point Mr. Mill just made, that in Psalm 2, at the very beginning of the psalm, where the nations plot in vain and they say, let us cast their cords from us, break the fetters, as Mr. Mill's translation says. And it speaks to this attitude that some human beings will always view the kingship of God as restrictive. It's not a blessing to them because they have a rebellious heart. And Mr. Mill said, that's such a great way to describe our humanist notions in our culture, post-enlightenment thinking, where, the human is the ultimate thinker and everything that exists is, what we can reason and logic and all these things. And then it starts to see Christianity as, oh, that's a restriction. I don't want to follow those rules. And yet those who have the hearts and the eyes of faith to see it recognize that the kingship of God is the ultimate good. It's not restrictive. It's a blessing. It's our hope. What are we going to do about death, deformity, Satan, demonic oppression, sin? What are we going to do about those? Humanism has no answer. Matthew's gospel tells us it's King Jesus. It's the reign of heaven that has come in Jesus. His healings, His raising of the dead, His exorcisms, His forgiveness of sins are all the signs that God's kingship has come, just as Isaiah promised. And it means blessings for creation, redemption, restoration. I'm having a bad problem with the mic today. I don't know what it is with the mic here. What other questions or thoughts do you have about seeing Jesus through the lens of Psalm 2? Well, let's look briefly at the second lens. The second allusion that the voice from heaven makes is from Isaiah 42. Because remember I said the second lens that we're given in the baptismal scene is that Jesus is the servant of God described in Isaiah. Would you turn to Isaiah 42? We're just going to read 4 verses here from Isaiah 42. And let's look and see what does it mean to see Jesus through the lens of the Isaianic servant? That is, the servant in Isaiah. Go to Isaiah 42. Let's read the first 4 verses. And the first couple lines of Isaiah 42, that's what the voice from heaven alludes to. So here it is, Isaiah 42, let's just read 1 through 4. Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. Now let's discuss this passage in its context, so then we can see what is Matthew wanting us to take from seeing Jesus through this lens as the servant of Isaiah, described here in Isaiah 42. Well, here's the first one. God's servant will be empowered by his Spirit. We see that in the second half of verse 1. I have put my Spirit upon him. God's servant will be empowered by God's Spirit. And what do you see happen in the baptismal scene? The Spirit, the Holy Spirit of God, comes and rests on Jesus. He is the agent of God's Spirit. He is the servant of Isaiah. And then second, notice that Isaiah 42 tells us that this servant's ministry will be unobtrusive. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Second point that I have on the screen is God's servant will establish justice in the earth. That's what this servant is going to do. You see that at the end of verse 1 of Isaiah 42. He will bring forth justice to the nations. And then look at what it says in verse 4. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth. This servant that Isaiah 42 promises will somehow establish the justice of God in his creation. And then third, this is the one I was getting ahead of myself. This servant's ministry will be unobtrusive. God's servant will be unobtrusive in his ministry. This is the point that's made in Isaiah 42. Look at verse 2. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. In other words, think about this. This servant is going to establish God's justice, but he's not going to be conspicuous. He's not going to stand on the street corner and say, I am the one. He's not going to even raise his voice. Just to get ahead of myself, think about that. Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, is there ever a point where Jesus says, I am the Messiah, come follow me. I am the king. He never says that. Now, he hints at it. He does actions to get people to see who he is, but he does not raise his voice in the street. He's unobtrusive, meek, humble. And then we're also told of this servant in Isaiah that he will nurture the weak. God's servant will nurture the weak. That's the point of the imagery in verse 3. Would you look at verse 3? This is beautiful imagery of the servant's ministry. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. In other words, imagine a reed that's been bruised. It's almost broken. You can maybe walk by it and just flick it, and boom, the reed's broken. This servant is not going to break a bruised reed. Or think of a candle where the wick is almost smoldering. The slightest snuffs it out. This servant will not quench that flame. He will nurture the weak. And somehow, through that meek and nurturing demeanor, he will establish God's justice. Isn't that the opposite of how we think it should go? I mean, if you had all power, is that how you would establish justice in the earth? Or are you like me and you'd say, all right, time to wipe out these evildoers. I'm going to bring justice to the earth through force. I'm just going to run over these evildoers. And yet Isaiah says that's not how God's going to do it. He's going to do it through a servant who's going to be so meek and gentle, he won't even break a bruised reed. But he will establish justice in the earth. Well, God, how are you going to do that? Isaiah doesn't tell us, but Matthew does. In the crucified King, Jesus. Well, let's pivot with that thought. What does Matthew want us to see by seeing Jesus through the lens of the servant of Isaiah 42? Well, here's what Matthew wants us to see. In the baptismal scene of Matthew 3, we see that Jesus is empowered by God's Spirit to accomplish His will. When the Holy Spirit comes upon Jesus after His baptism, He becomes the agent of God's Spirit. He's the servant of Isaiah. And so the rest of His ministry will be Him empowered by the Spirit of God to accomplish God's purposes of bringing justice to the earth. Second, if Jesus is the servant of Isaiah 42, then that means that He is the one who will establish justice in the earth. He will establish justice in the earth. But it also means, as we'll see in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is going to do that by being unobtrusive in His ministry. It doesn't mean Jesus never speaks in anger. He does. Jesus speaks in anger. He speaks with force at times, to the Jewish leaders particularly. But He doesn't do things to bring attention to Himself. He brings the reign of heaven, the kingship of God, in a way that He later describes in Matthew 13 as leaven in dough. You won't even see it happening. You can miss it. He's unobtrusive. But we'll also see in Matthew's gospel that He nurtures the weak. Jesus will constantly, in Matthew's gospel, reach out and call the social outcasts, the ones who are bruised, the ones who are broken, the ones who are almost out. They're smoldering. He will call them and bring them to Himself to heal them. And then finally, Jesus will accomplish God's will as both an individual and as the representative of corporate Israel. We won't turn there, but let me just mention, in Isaiah 42 is not the only time the servant of Isaiah is described. There are other times in Isaiah where the servant is described, but it's very clear that the servant is the nation of Israel. Well, how can the servant be the nation of Israel and also an individual? Well, that mystery is solved in Jesus, because remember what we've discussed in this class. Matthew has presented Jesus as Israel embodied. he is the representative of Israel. And so he then solves that mystery. He will accomplish God's will as a person, Jesus, but as the representative of Israel itself, the nation. And so let's just take two takeaways from this lens. You could write these at the bottom of 37. These are not in your book. Let me close with these. What does it mean for us to see Jesus through the lens of Isaiah 42? Because that's what the voice from heaven wants us. That's how the voice from heaven wants us to see Jesus. Through the lens of Psalm 2 and through the lens of Isaiah 42. Well, here's what this means, brethren. Servanthood is God's means of achieving victory over Israel. Servanthood is God's means of achieving victory over Israel, or victory over evil. In Isaiah 42, the goal of the servant is to bring justice to the earth, victory for God's values. And yet, he says he's going to do that through servanthood, a meek and lowly servant. That's completely contrary to our human ways of thinking. Establishing justice would happen through power, force, not with God. It's through servanthood. And then second, if we understand this point, that God will accomplish his victory through his servant, Jesus, then we need to understand this second point. Servanthood is the way we align ourselves with the kingdom of heaven. Servanthood is the way we align ourselves with the kingdom of heaven. If you long for justice, if you are so weary of seeing evil people in the world take advantage of the helpless, if you are tired of seeing the world promote evil values that are contrary to God, what you long for is God's servant from Isaiah 42, the one who will bring God's justice to earth. But the extension of that is, we need to recognize that if we want to be part of that victory, if we want to be aligned with the reign of heaven, the kingdom of heaven, then our only option is to be servants ourselves, so that we can be aligned with the King, so that we can be part of his eternal kingdom. This is the very point Jesus makes to his disciples when he calls them and says to them, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. The servant of Isaiah 42 is telling his disciples, if you want to be a part of what I'm doing, if you want to be a part of the reign of heaven, you have to be a servant like me. You have to follow my footsteps. And so servanthood, brethren, is the means by which God will achieve victory, but it's also the way that we align ourselves to his victory. If we want to be a part of it, we have to be a servant like him. So these are the two lenses. These are the two lenses that Matthew gives to us in the baptismal scene. Jesus is the Son of God, that is the Davidic king, promised in Psalm 2 to reign over the whole world. But he is also at the same time the servant of Isaiah, who will, through his meekness, bring God's justice to earth. And what we will then begin to look at next Sunday is that Jesus, who has just had the Spirit put upon him and called God's Son, he will now go to the wilderness to face the ultimate enemy of God's reign, the ultimate enemy of humanity, the devil himself, Satan. And we'll start to look at that confrontation next Sunday. God be with you this week.